Hello and welcome to the Personality Unit. Today we're going to start a journey of looking at different perspectives in psychology that look to explain why we are the way that we are, what makes us who we are. There are four major perspectives that we can examine when looking at personality theory. There is trait theory, social cognitive theory, humanistic theory, and then the psychodynamic theory, which is really broken down into Freud's theory of personality and his followers, the Neo-Freudians, and how they differ from him. And there are also many issues in personality psychology that we will be taking a look at as well. Things like the nature versus nurture debate and whether or not we are born with these personalities. Continuity versus stages. Do we stay the same or do we change our personalities over our lifetime? Trait versus situation and stability versus change also looks at, does our personality change as we develop? And then consciousness versus unconsciousness asks the question, are we aware of what drives us? So let's start by talking about what exactly is personality. And psychologists define personality as an individual's thinking, feeling, and acting. So really it just is the way that a person is. And so different psychologists have different theories and ideas about what makes us who we are. What are all of the behind the scenes factors that contribute to the behaviors and thought process that we see in an individual at basically any given point in time. We're going to start today by looking at trait theory and social cognitive theory. So these two perspectives sort of compete with each other to describe and explain why we act the way that we do. We'll start here with trait theory, and trait theory tries to explain personality by patterns of behavior. So trait theorists believe that our personality is pretty stagnant, it's basically the same through our lifetime, and we can measure our personality by looking at specific traits that are enduring, ones that last throughout the course of our lifetime. So trait theory really begins with a man named Gordon Allport. For a mnemonic to help you remember Gordon Allport, I think Allport used all the words, 1,800 different words that he would use to describe personality. He broke personality traits into what are known as cardinal traits and central traits, and then secondary traits as well. Cardinal traits are traits that are the dominant part of our personality. So if you were to describe your personality to someone else, the words that you would use to describe who you are would probably fall into your cardinal traits. Central traits are ones that almost everybody seems to have. So maybe if you say something like, I have a sense of humor, or I'm honest, right? These are traits that many people might have in common. So these are what we consider to be central traits. And then secondary traits are only seen in certain circumstances. And that helps to account for the complexity of human nature and how different aspects of our being will come out in different situations. Raymond Cattell then came in and took those 1,800 personality traits and said, that's way too many. We shouldn't be using that many terms because chances are a lot of them have similarities. So Raymond Cattell decided to narrow down the different traits that we should use into 16 personality factors. And he used a concept known as factor analysis to decide which personality factors should be included. So basically what factor analysis is he took all of the similar personality traits and he grouped them together. He found what was common amongst them and turned them into clusters by grouping them together in order to narrow it down to what he felt were the 16 personality traits that we should use to describe a person's personality. Eventually, we'll see the big 5 personality traits, which is an even greater pared down version of that, where we look at 5 major personality traits and we can measure individuals on them. And our final trait theorist that we can look at is Hans Eysenck, who looked at personality in terms of these competing or opposing opposites. He would measure personality on the extremes of stability and instability and introversion and extroversion. This concept will also eventually be used in the creation of the Myers-Briggs type indicator that was inspired by the work of Carl Jung, a neo-Freudian who we'll look at later in this unit. But Eysenck was really interested in studying trait theory and these personality traits based on a person's biological predisposition, meaning he believed that whether a person is introverted or extroverted had a lot to do with the biology and the makeup of their brain. The way that Eysenck described personality was looking at how we biologically respond in our nervous system. The way that you can think about this is an introvert has naturally high levels of arousal. So high levels of brain activity, they're very naturally stimulated. And so when they need to be at their peak arousal level, chances are they need a very quiet environment. If you think about it this way, someone who's introverted, if their arousal levels are already very high, the more external information coming in from the outside world through conversations, loud noises, big spaces, are just going to put them over the edge. And that's going to be too much stimulation for them where they feel the need to withdraw. And that's why we might see introverts thrive more in quieter settings, maybe with less people. Smaller groups are where they might find greater success. Whereas extroverts have naturally lower levels of arousal. And so in order to put themselves into that optimal arousal level, they actually seek out those louder environments, larger groups of people, public spaces, and that seems to be where they thrive. That will put them into the arousal level that's necessary for their brain and their nervous system to think clearly and to process information. And so one reason we might see introverts and extroverts in our society actually comes down to their biological makeup. Now, in looking at trait theory and personality traits and different personality tests, it's also important to recognize that there are some limitations and criticisms to them. For example, looking at the Myers-Briggs personality type indicator, you might find someone who has the exact same MBTI personality type as you and realize that you are, in fact, still very different. That this is not the only way that we can describe someone's personality, and perhaps it's not the most successful way of describing a person's personality. However, two personality tests that do seem to have a greater level of validity that you'd like to be familiar with is the Big Five personality and the MMPI personality inventory. The Big Five measures our personality on 5 different traits: conscientiousness, agreeableness, neuroticism, openness, and extroversion. And every person can be measured as either high, average, or low on each of these traits. There are also sub-traits that go into that help give us a greater understanding of what that personality trait would look like. So someone who is high in conscientiousness might be very organized and careful, whereas someone very low might be maybe less organized, less dependable. Someone who is high on agreeableness is going to be very open to other people, more trusting of other people, where someone who scores low might be a little bit more cautious or suspicious when meeting new people. Neuroticism looks at emotional stability. So high neuroticism means someone that experiences a lot of emotions and often to the extremes, where low on neuroticism is going to be more emotionally stable. Openness looks at openness to experiences. So you can think someone who is high on openness likes to try new things, likes variety, where someone who scores lower is going to like their routines. And then extroversion is going to show us how outgoing a person is, how social they may be, and low on that is essentially introversion, where they are perhaps less outgoing or less social. You can think of the Big Five using 2 different mnemonics, whichever works for you, either canoe or ocean, to remember the 5 personality traits that we measure. Finally, the last personality test to be familiar with is called the MMPI, or the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. This one we see used more often when used to determine abnormalities, and it can be used as a tool in making a diagnosis in the field of psychology. We often won't see this test being used in our day-to-day lives unless a person is applying for, say, a job working in the government, where they might use this as part of the screening process. but it is a more valid tool that is used within the field of psychology as well. On the other side of trait theory is the competing theory on personality, and that is the social cognitive perspective. Essentially, what this boils down to is the argument of continuity versus change. Trait theorists are going to measure personality traits, and they believe that for the most part, these are pretty static, pretty much the same through our lifetime. Whereas the social cognitive perspective is going to say that our personality changes depending on the situation that we're in. The person that really introduced this idea of the trait versus situation debate is Walter Mischel, and he believed that our personalities change depending on the situation. So if you think about something like conscientiousness, if your room is very messy, but your car is very clean, do you score high or low on conscientiousness? Or does it depend on the situation? If you say it depends on the situation, that falls into this social cognitive theory. This idea that the way that we think about different environments, different social situations that we're in, are going to dictate how we respond and how we behave, that is the root of our personality. That is what motivates our behavior. So some of the theories that we look at in the social cognitive field include Albert Bandura's reciprocal determinism. And this is a triangular theory that looks at the way that we think, our environment, and our behavior, and how these all work to mutually reinforce each other. They're both the cause and effect of our personality, of the way that we think and the way that we act on a regular basis. The way that you can think about this is think about a behavior such as bungee jumping, for example, and ask yourself what would lead a person to decide to go bungee jumping. What we might see in one area are the person's traits or thoughts. So maybe they are a type of person who is open to new experiences, or they like to think about how they can experience the next thrill. They are adrenaline junkies. Then we have the behavior itself of bungee jumping and the environment where they go to do this. And perhaps as they go bungee jumping, they make new friends, they meet other people who like doing these adventure-seeking activities as well. So with these three different components, we can see how a behavior such as bungee jumping can be mutually reinforced. Because when you're bungee jumping, that is probably what you're thinking about, and you're in that environment. You're also going to be with specific people who you engage in this activity with. When you're with those people, chances are you are either thinking about and talking about bungee jumping, or you're getting ready to go do that task. And when you're doing that task, you are with those people and you're thinking about the task at hand. And so those three parts of the triangle, you can see the arrows going in both directions because they're constantly mutually reinforcing each other. That the more time you spend with those people, the more you're going to do those activities. The more you do those activities, you're going to be thinking about it and spending more time in that environment. And so that is how this sort of continues on and on. With some behaviors, we might be able to see the origin, where it started. With others, they may be so long enduring that we can't actually pinpoint where this reciprocal determinism triangle actually began. But the idea is how we think about our situation is going to influence how we act, and that is why this falls into the social cognitive field of psychology. Some other social cognitive terms that Bandura introduced also include self-efficacy, which is essentially our belief of whether or not we will be successful at something. If you have high self-efficacy, you're more likely to stick with things that are difficult and find more success in them long term. If you have low self-efficacy for a task, you're more likely to perhaps not put in as much effort or give up more easily. So we are more likely to engage in activities based on how we think about them. If we believe we'll be successful, we're more likely to stick with it. If we don't believe that, we're less likely to. So again, the way that we think is going to influence the way that we act. And you can see self-efficacy really goes hand in hand with self-fulfilling prophecies, because our behavior is going to predict the outcome, and we can become a self-fulfilling prophecy based on the way that we think, influencing our actions. Locus of control is another social cognitive vocab term. And the reason why locus of control is a social cognitive vocab term, it's because the way that we think about our lives is going to influence how we act. So locus of control is a belief. It's a belief system about where the control is in our life. If you have an internal locus of control, it means that you believe that you have control of your outcomes. If you have an external locus of control, you believe that something else, whether that is luck, fate, a powerful being, God, whatever it may be, is in control of your destiny instead. And where you place that belief is going to influence how you approach your life. But the idea here is that locus of control is a belief. Maybe it's true that you are in control of your destiny, or maybe it's true that someone else is. But our actions are going to be predicated on what we think, what we believe, and that's going to influence how we approach the different scenarios we are faced with. When looking at where we place control in our life, or our belief of having control in our life, we can also be faced with learned helplessness. And this is what happens when faced with a series of uncontrollable events. Gives us this feeling like we no longer have control in our lives. So if you think about times where it seems like nothing you can do can change the situation you're in, that's going to lead to this feeling of helpless behavior, of learned helplessness, where you feel like sort of giving up because nothing you do is changing the outcome. And then finally, by looking at our self-efficacy and our locus of control, we can bring these ideas together to look at our attributional styles, how we explain the success and failure that we are faced with. Attribution theory brings together this idea of self-efficacy and locus of control to help us explain how we explain the outcomes that we experience in our life. So for example, if we fail at something, how we explain that and how it affects the way that we think and act. So if we're looking at something like failing, the question is, where do we place the blame? Is it internal or is it external? Is it stable or is it unstable? Meaning, does this always happen to us or is this very rare? Is it global or is it specific? Does it only happen in this specific instance, or does this happen to us all the time and in many different scenarios? The way that we answer those three questions can lead to us having either an optimistic or pessimistic attributional style. And the idea here is, if we fail but have an optimistic attribution style, we're basically saying that it's okay, that it's because of something outside of our control, or something I can control, but that I did not do this time, meaning I know it can change. The idea with an optimistic attributional style is when we answer those questions, we know that there is room for us to change and grow, and so how we approach the next scenario is more likely to be more positive. If we have a pessimistic attributional style, we answer those questions as internal and global and stable, meaning I failed because of something I did, and it's always going to be this way, and it's never going to change. And you can hear how pessimistic that explanation is, and how that can then affect how we approach other areas, other challenges that we face in our life. So you can see with social cognitive perspective, the way that we think is going to have a huge impact on the way that we approach different scenarios. The way that we think about ourselves and the world around us can help us to understand why a person chooses to act a certain way in response. So creating things like a self-serving bias, where we explain the outcomes in a way that will always make us look positive. If I get an A, it's because I'm smart. If I get an F, it's because the test was unfair. If I win the election, it's because of what I did, because I'm the best candidate. And if I lose, it's because the system was rigged. Right? A self-serving bias helps us to make sure that we always look good. We can also self-handicap, which is sabotaging ourselves so we have an excuse for why we fail. So before the night of a big basketball game, staying up really late playing video games so that when the performance the next day is bad, you can say it's because you didn't get enough sleep the night before. So it's a way to have a built-in excuse in case things don't go well. The spotlight effect influences our behavior if we think that other people are constantly watching us. Our self-esteem is going to dictate our behavior based on how we view ourselves. and possible selves. When we imagine the future for ourselves, how we view ourselves in the future is going to motivate our behavior. If I want to be a successful business person, then the behaviors that I make now are going to help lead to that possible self. And if I don't do whatever I need to do right now, I can imagine a future self that is not happy and not as successful as I want them to be. And that is going to motivate my behavior to go ahead and change. So this is the idea that everything that we think about ourselves and the situations that we're in are going to influence the way that we choose to act. So the social cognitive perspective, you can kind of think of it as the cognition, the thinking comes first. We think about the situation, and then that is going to dictate our behavior. And so our behavior is constantly changing depending on the social situation that we're in. So these are the first two theories of personality. The next time we meet, we're going to look at theories such as humanism and Freud's personality theory. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, remember, be kind to your mind.